Sim, no voeiro, mas consigo. So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you, all of you, to this second session of FLAD's series dedicated to the United States of America elections that will take place soon. And it's even a greater pleasure to see some of the ones that were here in the first conference. They risk it to come back. So thank you. And we'll try to be correspondent response. In fact, last month, FLAD launched a series of, thank you, I was using someone else's glasses and they are a little bit foggy. So I couldn't see much. Last month, FLAD launched a series of sessions that will bring to Portugal some important experts from the United States to discuss the challenges that the United States face, both in the domestic point of view as well as in the prospects of foreign policy going forward after the election. In the first session, we spoke mainly about the change, the risks, the challenges that the transatlantic relationship face with and after these elections. We invited Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of the think tank New America, and a reference in the field of international affairs. Anne-Marie was a professor at Harvard Law School and dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She was also director of policy planning in the US State Department, appointed by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. She is contributing editor to the Financial Times and a regular columnist for Project Syndicate. Also a note to thank Márcia Rodrigues to have accepted the challenge to start dialogue and guide us through these sessions that are and will take place. Today, we will zoom out to look at the 2024 election year. In fact, if we zoom out and see the world, we can note and question the result of being a year with so many elections in so many key countries that will take place in this year. So it's a year when millions, dozens of millions of people in the world will go to the polls, and democracy will be exercised by voters and challenged by the current dynamics that we see are starting and growing all around the world. This looking mainly, obviously, to the transatlantic relations, not only with the United States, but with all the American continent and ourselves, and having that present and looking at the challenges of this year will be some of the starting points for these conversations. Just an additional note, I'm not trying to be a third speaker, but just to give you notes of one or two things that are taking place in FLAD, and with Anne-Marie's permission, just to note that we try to focus on opening the door. FLAD tries and will try to open the door. This meaning, in fact, the symbolic opening of the front door that for years and decades has been shut down. And there was no open way to come into FLAD. And we always had this sometimes awkward situations, not knowing where to enter, where to come in, and who to phone and how to do it. And it's just simple. We just open the door. And let it happen. Let's transform FLAD more focused on the outside than on the inside. FLAD doesn't mean anything if we don't have the public understanding and the public sharing with us of our work. In the same line, we will start with a series of open days, meaning, for instance, a Saturday, and we are doing that in partnership with Vieira da Silva Foundation. So we will be sharing contents and we will be sharing moments in this open day, meaning what in fact the residence of the Prime Minister has done these last years. A place to visit art and to visit an exhibition that is changing permanently, an exhibition of art, and at the same time visit the installations and be inside the houses, either the residence of the Prime Minister or FLAD. So we will start soon with this open days. Also, the election day, the election in the United States. The election day, we usually do something, and this time we will try to do it more substantially, meaning that it's not just a moment to be together and see TV. It can be a moment to listen to one or two panels of Portuguese and Americans thinking and sharing their ideas about this important night. It's also a moment, because FLAD has various settings. It's also a moment where we can have some classical or jazz music played by some of the players that we support and have helped through times, and now having them here and having a musical moment. So trying to make it a little bit more elastic, more alive. I look at you, and some of you will be guests in that night. So it's again an idea of trying to open. And finally, he told me, I never understood why there wasn't a FLAD agenda. I have a Gulbenkian agenda. I have Serrov's agenda if I want. But if I want to look at FLADs, I never know what they're doing, because I have to be pressing the button, because sometimes it's only with 5 days or 2 weeks that things are announced, and I want to participate. So we will try to start next year with an agenda. Obviously, it will be, let's say, a test. So pardon us for all the mistakes and undoings that will take place, but it's a starting, and we have to put things moving. And obviously, we'll be doing a big disclaimer, and we'll be trying to update it each 2 or 3 months. But anyway, hopefully, you will have next year flood agenda. So those are just appointments of a new way, of a new time in floods, that we want to be a time of improvement and not a time of disruption. There is nothing that justifies a disruption. We respect all the effort and all the long way that floods and flood people, the ones who work here each single day, have come from so far until today. We respect that. We want to do more, and this time we want to do more with the public help. And the way to do it is to open it and to make the community feel that flood is, after all, has to be a community project, a shared project. So, Anne-Marie and Márcia, thank you again,
Thank you.
And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, welcome all. We all know Anne-Marie Slaughter. 2024, the year of democracy. The year is not over yet. American elections are not yet over. So, until now, the results, what they do reflect of the elections worldwide.
I was going to say, in the United States, the year of election might not be over until 2025. Let us hope that that is not the case, but we cannot assume. So first of all, I should say how pleased I am to be here, and I'm truly grateful to all of you for coming out in what is really quite some weather. And I understand this is not usual for Lisbon, so I'm particularly appreciative that you didn't just decide, you know, it's really raining, I think I'll stay home. Thank you. So I do think it's important to start by zooming out. You know, in January and February, there were all sorts of newspaper articles on, more people will vote this year, nearly 2 billion people, and this is a year that democracy is on trial. And yes, until we get through the American election, we are not going to be able to make any final assessments. But I think you can see some surprises to begin with. So there are a number of different categories. One, you can see that in places like Germany and France, you have the center-held, or the coalition, really the sort of centrist government coalition held, but lost votes on both the left and the right. And you saw that both in Germany and definitely in France. And there you can see what I think is really a grave concern, that in a time of polarization, it's very hard to try to be a moderate, to try to be somebody who sees both sides. You very quickly just get dumped on by both sides, or you lose votes to both sides. And that, I think, is a concern in both countries. Everyone's worried now about the next elections. But then you can see also some surprises. I mean, the Polish election, which was earlier, but still, that was surprising to a number of people, that in fact, the moderate parties came back into power, and now they have they're not aligned with the president. That's the Polish system, but that was important. The biggest surprise, I think, for many of us were the Indian elections. I think that Modi expected to win, expected to, really be affirmed in his government to date, and he has done many things that many Indians are strongly supportive of. But he's undercut civil liberties in lots of ways, and then he has also, been a populist, using ethnic divisions, religious divisions, and so he got corrected. He is still in power, but in power, obviously, we're having to now compromise, and so that's another way of looking at, at something where you might have expected a more extreme result to be more moderate. And then you have elections. I mean, you have elections like in Britain. It wasn't a huge surprise that the Tory government lost. I mean, there the polls were enormous, but a very clear rejection of that government and a return to a new government. And then countries like Mexico and Argentina, and Argentina's again a big surprise, where Milei is elected. The Argentinians have a history often of you sort of wanting to vote out the incumbents and vote in the new. But then in Mexico, where you have Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman president of Mexico, she is of the same party, but she is a different voice in that party. And the Mexicans are still voting for change because this is still not the traditional institutions. So you start with that, and you actually see a much more nuanced and complicated picture than democracy is on trial and is it going to win or is going to lose. Again, the United States, there's no possibility of compromise. One side or the other is going to win, and depending what happens, that's going to color the way we see the year. But I think we're in a turbulent time. We're in a time of enormous change. We're in a time of a lot of threats, geopolitical threats and global threats. Technology changing sort of daily. I have two sons in their 20s, and there is nothing I can tell them to do that is a guaranteed secure career for the rest of their lives, because most of the jobs, even if they get them, those jobs will change pretty radically over the course of their lives. So that kind of change is deeply unsettling. So you have a turbulent, unsettled world. It's not surprising that politics reflect that. It's not surprising that we get extreme parties coming in and offering very simple solutions. And I would say overall, the verdict is mixed, but definitely one that still offers us plenty of hope for democracy.
So your elections are...
Don't have me back in December, but for now.
Your elections are quite soon, right?
Yes.
So
November
how
5th.
healthy is the American democracy now?
So American democracy is more fragile than at any time in my lifetime. So I'm 66 years old. I was born in 1958. I don't really remember the 60s. The first election I remember was Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, and Lyndon Johnson won. And I remember I was 6 years old at the time, and everybody was talking about the race. And I imagined two candidates running up and down hills. That's my first political memory. But at any rate, in my lifetime, and I remember right after I graduated from college, Ronald Reagan won, and many Democrats thought, what is the country coming to? Now Ronald Reagan is regarded as a sort of pillar of the presidency. It is fragile. I will not try to hide that. There is a very significant risk of political violence, probably a state-based. I'm not talking about civil war breaking out, but of real turbulence mixed with at least isolated or sporadic violence if there is not a clear winner. And they're close, and given both we have early voting and absentee ballots and all the other ways, it's going to take us a while before I think we are clear, and that period is fragile.
So you are highly polarized.
We are highly polarized.
We all know
question.
that.
Yes.
But the polarization in America is not just political, right? There are main gaps, big divides in the American society.
Yes. So I think you start with three enormous changes in the United States. And I run an organization called New America, and we are a think tank. We're also an action tank. We do a lot of direct work. And we are trying to make the big changes we think you need to make for the New America. So what's the New America? Well, in 2026, we will have the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I understand in Portugal, that recent government there, it's, what we think is old is quite different. But, I remember the bicentennial in 1976. That was a very big deal. Oddly, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came to Washington. Of all the things you think you'd want to celebrate on the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, British royalty seems like an odd choice. But nevertheless, we had lots of fireworks, tall ships sailed into the New York harbor. And this will be a very big celebration. Well, it will be a commemoration and a celebration and a time of reflection. But for the next 250 years, a country that has been 80% European American for its history, 80%. I'm half Belgian, my husband's half Hungarian. We're very directly European American, but effectively, if you were European American, you were American. Everybody else has a hyphen. African American, Asian American, Hispanic American. Those are the groups with a hyphen because the majority was so clear. For the next 250 years, there will not be a majority ethnic or religious or racial group. Now, you're here in Europe, 10% foreign-born in many countries, 15%, and the politics reflect that, and it's very turbulent. Just imagine if from 1965 to roughly 2045, you go from 80% of a majority to no majority. And that country will be, again, somewhere around 49% European American. It'll be roughly 25 to 30 to 35% Hispanic American, and then African American, Asian American, just about everybody. And people will be increasingly mixed. So I hope that we'll get to a point where we stop all the hyphens and all the sort of identifications and we just say we're American. But it's not surprising that that would create enormous social turbulence because my generation of Americans, many, look around and say, we don't recognize our country. Many other Americans, I'm one, say, this is the greatest thing about this country. And just as we've had generations of European immigrants, now we have generations of immigrants from all over the world. But that's a huge change, and it is behind a lot of the polarization, not all of it. The second is absolutely economic, both globalization, the tremendous changes in our country through globalization and the tremendous growth in inequality. I grew up arguing with my Belgian relatives that, that America was the country of opportunity. And you could come to the United States and, your father could be a janitor and your mother could be working in any sort of very poor paid job. And in one generation, you could make it to the middle class, you could make it rich. That is now more true in Europe than it is in the United States, which is very hard for most Americans even to believe and to accept. So that's a huge change. And a lot of Americans do feel left behind. And a lot of those Americans are in rural parts of the country. They look at the coast, they look at all the money, and there's a lot of anger there. And then the change of just the technology, again, that we're all going through, but our lives, my life is already completely unrecognizable from my parents, and our children's lives, who knows, with AI. And then finally, the changes of being in a world where, actually, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, said, and I strongly agree, climate change is the existential threat of our time. That is not something we can fight against with arms. We can use diplomacy, but fundamentally we've got to come together as a world. And that's a very big, different kind of challenge than worrying about the Soviet Union, worrying about Russia, worrying about China, any other states. So all of that change, people respond to it differently, and all of it plays a role in the polarization in the United States.
You pay a lot of attention to the gender gap in America.
Well, I would.
How big is that?
The political gender gap is relatively new. I mean, I'm not saying that men and women have always voted the same. Of course, they haven't. But you can see very clearly between the support for Donald Trump and the support for Kamala Harris, within the same groups. So within, whether it's a racial group or whether it's an education group, because in general, college-educated people are more likely to be for Kamala Harris, non-college educated people are more likely to be for Donald Trump, but there again, within college-educated white men, more for Trump. Women, much more for Kamala Harris. That's true among African-American voters, Hispanic voters. So we are seeing in this election, and we saw it in the 2020 election, but not as big, a real gender divide.
The structure of your political system, is that a problem for democracy?
Yes. I think so. So not all Americans agree on anything, but on this one, we have an 18th century political system for a 21st century country and world. And honestly, in that 18th century political system, our founding fathers, and they were founding fathers, did not believe that we would have parties. They didn't like parties. You read James Madison on faction, and they thought parties would disappear. So in that regard, their political science was very bad, because we've had parties from the beginning. And our system, a presidential system, first past the post, means you can basically be ruled by minorities, right? The president, for the past couple of elections, has won or Trump certainly won the majority, lost the majority vote, but won the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is set up that way. But even more, right now, if you could have third and fourth parties in the United States, you would definitely have them. You'd probably have a moderate party, you might have a green party, you might well have more extreme parties on the right and the left. But our population would look more like the distribution of a European country where you might have 20 to 25% hard right, hard left, but everybody else would be somewhere else. And we can't do that in our country. We cannot create new parties without handing the election to the party we don't want. So we need a system, and many states are starting, 2 states have made these changes, other states, there are 5 states where some form of voting is on the ballot that would lead to more proportional representation. And that would allow you to create a party without destroying one of the others. I'm going to give you a very concrete example, because all of this is very abstract. So in the late 19th century, you had what was called fusion voting. So Abraham Lincoln was elected because 4 different parties gave the new Republican Party, they voted for that candidate. They voted for Abraham Lincoln. At the turn of the 20th century, most states outlawed fusion voting. Fusion voting is where you have a party, but you don't have a candidate. You endorse one of the other candidates. You fuse your votes with another. So New Jersey created a moderate party. Non-Trump Republicans wanted a moderate party that was center-right. And they wanted to endorse the Democratic candidate for the House. And they would want now to endorse the Democratic candidate for the presidency. But they're Republicans, they're just not Trump Republicans. That is illegal under the New Jersey Constitution, because you are not allowed to have a party that doesn't run a separate candidate. But that's ridiculous. There's no reason it should be illegal. We are suing, other people are suing. In Kansas, they've created a United Kansas Party to do the same thing. That's Kansas. That's really quite significant. And so states can bring back fusion voting. They can adopt different ways of voting, what we call ranked choice or instant runoff voting. All of those will allow you to have more proportional representation, more competition, more representation of the country we are. And then you'll get to a place where 70% of Americans support basically Roe v. Wade type restrictions on abortion, 70% support gun safety restrictions, 70% or 60 to 70% believe that climate change is in fact caused by humans. You wouldn't know that from our political system, but that's where the country is.
So you have now 2 parties. You were very far away from that.
We're not very far, but we're far. We're getting there.
And these 2 parties have 2 very different views of the role of America in the world.
Yes.
foreign affairs issues are not very important for the Americans when they vote, but these two different views have a tremendous impact on American foreign policy. What do you see ahead?
Yes. Yes, for those of us who do foreign policy, every 4 years we get put in our place because the issues that we think are just absolutely essential to everyone, come in sort of at the bottom of the top 10 issues for what Americans vote on. They vote on the economy, they vote on social and cultural issues. But yes, the contrast is as strong as it was in 2016. In 2016, I think very few people expected a Trump administration, but effectively, Kamala Harris will continue Biden's foreign policy broadly. As Biden-Harris both believes in partners, in that we are much stronger when we are together with our allies and partners, and Biden and Harris, and certainly Biden's foreign policy team, has worked very hard to renew partnerships, NATO, European partnerships, but also to build new ones. A lot of those are security partnerships, but others are things like, and we'll talk about this, the partnership for the New Atlantic Partnership. So looking at countries around the Atlantic, bringing them together, bringing countries together to work on COVID vaccines and other issues. So I think Kamala Harris will continue that. I do expect that she will probably try to focus even more on global issues like climate change, like drugs, like pandemics, food security, water security, issues that the Biden-Harris national security strategy recognizes as just as important as fighting China or Russia or North Korea or Iran, but it's very hard to find the time and energy and resources to put behind those issues. Donald Trump has made very clear that he wants America to put its interests first. That means that he doesn't believe in alliances for alliances' sake. It's not that he won't ally, but it's going to be very transactional. It's going to be, you and I will do a deal for this purpose. And he made pretty clear last time that he was willing to do a deal with Kim Jong-un if he thought that was going to be something that the country could benefit from, and he likes deals. So the biggest change, he's made very clear that he will not support supporting Ukraine. So for Europe, obviously, that's a huge difference. Europe is doing more for Ukraine than the United States is now. We're doing the most in military aid, but if you look at Germany and Britain, they're the second and third donors of military aid, and on economic and humanitarian aid, Europe is leading. But Europe would have to somehow fill the military gap. There are other countries who will get, Canada's still there, there are other countries, even Japan, but that would be just an enormous change. And he is prepared to, he says, to do a deal with Putin. He'd do a very different deal probably on the Middle East. So yes, it's a very, very big difference. It's not as simple as isolationism versus multilateralism, because he's not necessarily an isolationist on everything, but he's going to call each issue he will call as he sees it in American interest.
So in that option, the president is not going to work to break the partnership with no limits between Russia and China. Is that clear for you?
I mean,
because he really adores Putin. But I would say this, but not so much Xi Jinping, right?
No, well, no. And I think, so I didn't mention differences on China. There are similarities on China. I mean, they certainly both, again, I expect Kamala Harris to continue the Biden-Harris emphasis on making sure that we don't export really sensitive technology to China, maintaining the Quad and some of the other alliances or partnerships that have been created in the Pacific to certainly provide a counterweight to China. I think that it's very hard to know. Trump and his supporters are very anti-China. Would he really put a 60% tariff on, you know, Chinese goods? That could be an enormous disruption of the global economy. You know, it's an interesting question that, you know, would he try to do a deal with Putin but not Xi Jinping? I think, again, I think he'd do a deal with anybody who'd do a deal with him. But I definitely...
Just to say I made it.
Right, but I think, here's the difference. Excuse me. I don't think it's as simple as liking strongmen, although I think that is true for Donald Trump, and he said so, that he admires people who, you know, govern in a very strong way. I also think if you look at Putin, but if you look at Orban, if you look at certain other autocrats in the world, there's also a very conservative ideology. It is anti-women in many ways. It's a sense that we need to go back to better times, and that a lot of the cultural change that has happened in terms of inclusion includes sexual orientation, women, that is dangerous. So that's where I think he sees a connection to Putin that I'm not sure he sees to Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping is a very different kind of ruler. He's a communist ruler still.
In your opinion, the next president should work to break that partnership between two powers that are nuclear powers. They are not allies, but they are partners, right? Is that good for the U.S. Democracy? I mean, foreign policy of the U.S. was quite against that, right?
I don't think it's good. No, it's not good. I don't think that if I were advising the next administration, the Democratic administration, I would not say, let's spend a huge amount of time trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China. In the first place, I think China is a potentially actual and potential moderating influence on Russia. You know, Xi Jinping made very clear when Putin was threatening to use a nuclear weapon that was just not going to be on the table. So I don't think it's like the Sino-Soviet alliance, which was very different during the Cold War when Russia was the much bigger power and they were part of a larger communist alliance. I think what I would emphasize is competing with our allies, with Europe, with other allies, and offering a value proposition around the world in terms of our technology, in terms of investment, in terms of the support for democracy, but also for the kind of values that we stand for. I would emphasize competing over focusing on breaking up particular alliances.
Well, anyway, including to the U.S., right? The great threats are global, are not Ukraine and Taiwan and Iran, are climate change and main issues that are extremely important for everybody. I mean, the U.S. cannot solve any of those issues without China. So cooperation should be increased instead of this permanent atmosphere of attrition because of Taiwan?
So I think, you know, what this administration has said, and really the 2022 National Security Strategy is a historic document. I don't expect everybody to feel quite as fervently about it as I do, but it is a document that says that it doesn't say that China and Russia and Ukraine, Iran and North Korea are not important threats. They are important threats. But it does say that those other challenges, and it lists climate change, infectious disease, terrorism, food security, inflation, that those challenges, it specifically says these are not secondary issues. These are not marginal issues. They are just as important as geopolitical issues. It's very hard to do both at the same time. And I think this administration started out in so strongly against China that we got to the point we were talking about war over Taiwan, and that made it impossible to cooperate on the issues we have to cooperate. I think they've corrected that course, and in part Europe is helpful here because Europe has its own problems with China, but you're in a different position than the United States is. So what I think the trick is to be able to do both. And it is, again, to focus on more than just the Northern Hemisphere and our traditional enemies or allies. We all, and China is doing this, and Russia is doing this, we need to be focusing much more on Africa, on South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central and Latin America. And that is true because of the global problems, but that is also true because those are important countries, and they are demanding that we pay attention to them and that they have a right, they have a voice in world affairs.
Global South is also
Global
majority, right? So global majority feels resented with several things, right? One of them is that formula that Joe Biden had in the beginning of the administration, autocracy versus democracy. The other is that the main issues like poverty or climate change that pretty affects them are not, in terms of action policy, the main issues for the USA. And then, as you mentioned, China and Russia, but China usually have huge support for African countries. A few days ago, 2 weeks ago, I believe, there was a summit in Beijing where the UN was. Guterres was there, the Secretary General. And there was 50 African countries there. Yep. So America doesn't do that for a while. And Global South has today a huge impact on the global order, right?
So I remember someone saying to me once that if you saw a picture of an African child, or a poor child anywhere, but an African child without shoes, an American would immediately think, oh, we need to send the child shoes. And a Chinese person would say, oh, there's a market for shoes in Africa, right? And I do think that that's a caricature, but it does capture something important, where China sees much of the rest of the world as a market, as a place for investment. Now, China also, again, it's a state-run economy, and it determines where those funds get spent. So the Bridge and Road Initiative, and also before that, wanting places to grow food in other parts of the world, wanting places for resources, has engaged commercially much more, where the United States has engaged more with development assistance, democracy promotion, and in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we engaged in development terms, but much less so recently. So that does need to shift. And the good news, I think, is that with our American technology, and there we have an edge on the Chinese, with clean technology, and here Europe has the lead in many ways, but many of the things that countries around the world really need going forward, Americans and Europeans can be competitive. We need to develop new systems of financing, right? And that needs to go through the World Bank and the IMF, but it needs to go through many other ways of providing public money and crowding in private money, so that it isn't, if you're a government and you're looking for how am I going to build my railroad, you don't have a choice between the Chinese who are going to build it for you and the Americans who are going to give you a much smaller pot of money and are probably going to lecture you along the way. Doesn't mean that I don't think we should stand for values, but I do think that this administration understands that, and I know that a Harris administration would be very strong there.
Just two questions related. I mean, America was very clear since day one about the war in Ukraine. No American troops on the ground whatsoever. They don't allow missiles, long-range missiles to attack inside Russia. And they don't want to talk about a nuclear war. Yeah. In spite of the many times that Putin mentions the nuclear issue. So this is very clear, a clear limit of American intervention. In Israel, do you believe that that will be a different case? Because now American troops are indeed going to Israel to operate the Dahad anti-missiles. So how different will be this, right?
Why don't we have some hard questions?
The last one.
No, this is So here's how I think you need to understand it. It's really a question of offense versus defense. So the United States is willing to do everything, not the whole United States, this administration has been extremely strong on supporting Ukraine, in helping Ukraine defend itself in every way we can against the Russian aggression. And the one place where we've drawn a line, I mean, we've drawn lots of lines and ultimately around specific weapon systems, but the administration's come around. But here, President Biden has to think to himself, as much as he wants Ukraine to defeat Russia, at some point, if you used an American weapon to, that kills Russians, that takes out a Russian town, that will be read, can easily be read as an act of American aggression against Russia directly. And at that point, we spent the entire Cold War worrying about those scenarios and worrying about, so then he uses a nuclear weapon, and do we preempt that strike, or do we wait for that nuclear weapon and then we retaliate? We can still blow up the world very easily. That threat is still there. So that, for Biden, as much as he supports Ukraine, is a line where he simply can't cross it. He's not going to be the president that got us into nuclear war. In Israel, I think if Israel were asking for American weapons to use against Iran, I think we'd say absolutely not. We are not going to support you in a direct conflict.
Offensive weapons.
Offensive weapons. This is very different. This is, we believe that the Israeli people have a right to security. We will support you in shooting down Iranian missiles. And the last time, it wasn't the last Iranian missiles, it was the time before that, it was the United States, Britain, France, Jordan, and UAE, who all joined in helping shoot down those missiles. And that's, I think, similarly, we don't want a war between Israel, an all-out war between Israel and Iran, because we could get dragged into it, and we absolutely don't want that. So there is consistency. It just takes a good bit of reasoning to get there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Now, the floor for Q&A. We have here some young students. Any one of them wishes to make a question?
In my age, all students are young. You're going to call on people, or do you want me to call?
I don't know, where is the mic? Oh, you have one up there.
Thank you for your presentation. Good evening. My name is Giuseppe Da Costa. I have a bachelor's in international relationships. And
sorry, where am I looking? Who's got
Yeah,
it's here?
up there.
Oh, right there. Thank you.
Yeah, the fine black man
Great.
here. And I'll split my question in two. It will be about the domestic policy and international policy. In domestic policy, I see that these elections are very important because we have a country very, very divided between the choice of abortion, inflation, and other economic issues, and some other social issues. So the first question will be, since the system of the United States, it's called democracy, either a democracy or a constitutional republic, because I've heard about it before. So after the election, will the United States be very solid in its domestic policy with all these divisions? And the second one is, since there's too much turmoil in the global scenario, with China and Russia teaming up against the West and the Cold War in the Middle East, because we know Iran has it funds terrorism throughout the region, and Israel is in the center, or the principal victim of this terrorism. So will the US be a very strong ally to Israel to contain Iran against the, well, should I say, I won't say containing Iran, but stopping the threat of all-out war in the Middle East?
Thank you. So on the first question, the answer is entirely up to Congress. I mean, if Kamala Harris wins and gets both houses of Congress, or even one house and it's close in the other, then I think you're going to see a continuation of a lot of bipartisan legislation that the Biden administration has passed. But the first thing she's going to fight for is an entire infrastructure of care. Because what got left out last time was child care, elder care, paid family leave, child tax credits, everything that supported families and working women. So she will be very strong for that. But it's quite likely, even if she's elected, that she only has one house or neither. Americans, the congressional races are not clear. And if she gets very close and one house is Republican and the other is very, very close, she's not going to be able to do that much. The same is true also of Donald Trump. So that's the answer to your first question. On the second question, so again, if it's Kamala Harris, she is going to continue both supporting Israel and pushing really hard for a Palestinian state. So for the security of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. And the question will be, that seems very unlikely, but the real question is going to come down to Saudi Arabia and other Arab states who, if I think even Netanyahu would do a deal for normalization with other considerations, but that will come down to how much both Saudi Arabia and others demand a real Palestinian state and not just negotiations that are not likely to lead anywhere. Donald Trump will support Israel in occupying the West Bank forever. He's made clear that as far as he's concerned, he is not going to stand for a Palestinian state. But Donald Trump really likes to do deals. So if he thought that if the Nobel Peace Prize were on the line for getting a Palestinian state and peace in the Middle East, who knows?
Thank you so much. Very enlightening, everything you've told us. Could you expand on the question that everyone has on, and I think, if Trump is elected, what is going to be the U.S. position in terms of climate change? We know that after the 2016 election, he took the United States out of the Paris Accord. A lot has happened since then. The states have taken on a much bigger role. The position of business has changed fundamentally with regard to climate change. Just how bad are things going to be in terms of the U.S. position on climate change if Trump is elected?
Not nearly as bad as we might think, for all the reasons you said. And also because the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to get pulled back. It is pouring money into red states, and it is providing enormous incentives for the energy transition. I also think, as you said, my read on American business is they know this change is coming. So obviously, there's a question of subsidies to fossil fuels. There's a question of more drilling. Yes, Trump will be far more favorable on all of that. But most business, for their stockholders, for their investors, for their employees, they are making zero carbon commitments of various kinds. And as you said, the states and the cities and the philanthropies, after Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, a whole group of mayors and philanthropists and governors came together and said, we're still abiding by the Paris commitments. Governor Newsom in California, he was meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister and the Mexican president, right? That was a kind of West Coast agreement. So if you look at where behavior has to change, obviously it matters whether the government is willing to make these commitments and make deals with other countries. But the behavior changes on the ground, and a lot of that is already in play. The other thing I will say is, as the younger generation comes into sort of full political power, they are a strong force because they are affected. So it's not good, but it's not nearly as bad as I think many people worry.
So we have now here a student that wishes to ask a question. I don't know, where is the mic?
Here comes the
right
mic.
Here.
Thank you for the talk. I'm a student at Carlucci American International School here in Lisbon. I'm a senior, and I was just wondering, do you think that China's recent movements into the African market should warrant a stronger reaction from the US and Europe, and how would that reaction look?
I mean, the reaction should be competition. I mean, I don't know what else again, I don't think we do ourselves any favors telling African governments not to buy Chinese technology if we do not have an alternative. You know, if I were the head of any of those governments and I'm trying to provide infrastructure and technology for my people, if I've got a good alternative, and I've got financing, and I've got private investment as well as public investment, absolutely, we should be all over that. But without that, I'm not sure what we really can do. We can protest, but it's not going to change behavior. But I absolutely think, and again, I think the Biden-Harris administration understands this. I just heard Jake Sullivan talking about lining up massive financing for the energy transition in Africa. That's exactly what we ought to be doing. And we should be, again, supporting many African governments, many middle powers around the world in coming together on their own and putting together their own packages, rather than, I think, saying to them, you have to choose between us and China. I don't think that's the right way.
All right, please. You got a girlie. Oh.
Yep.
He's up there.
Hi.
Sorry.
Whoever has the microphone
I'm
gets to ask the question.
I'm lost.
So after January 6th, I wrongly believed that Donald Trump's political career would be over because he had tried to overturn democracy, and Americans were supposed to care for democracy, and then 4 years later, it turns out he may be re-elected. Do you think that means that the average American does not care for democracy, or at least that they have a very shallow, self-centered concept of democracy, or half the country does not care for democracy? What do you make of this?
I understand why you feel that way. Many of us shared your view. And indeed, very briefly, the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, was condemning the January 6th. Actually, what the polls show is something very different, that both sides care passionately for democracy, and both sides believe the other side is destroying it. No, I'm quite serious here. If you listen, if you go to a Trump rally, it is Democrats who are corrupt, who are changing voting laws, who are actively willing to use the powers of the federal government to destroy our democracy and our country. And certainly that is true among Democrats, where we absolutely think that democracy is on the ballot, and we worry whether the institutions will hold a second time. If there's violence, if there's a second Trump administration, and he wants to change the nature of the federal government. So it's not that we don't care about democracy, it is that we live in almost completely separate worlds. We listen to different news, we hang out with different people, one group is much more religious than the other group, we have different cultural values, and so we really have lost the ability to see one another as somebody who might vote differently than I do, who might have a different view of the role of government than I do, who might have a different view on abortion than I do, but who is still a human being within a democracy. That's the real problem. It's not that we don't care.
Hi, I'm also with Carlucci American International School. I moved here from America last month. So my question is, how do you think a Trump election would affect the rights to bodily autonomy in the U.S.?
So when I talked about a gender divide, I don't think that abortion is the only issue about that. I really don't. I think the larger issue is the way you framed it. Who gets to control their own bodies? Who gets to decide family planning? Who gets to decide when you make complicated medical decisions that involve the life of the mother and the life of the fetus? Who gets to, and that certainly does include the decision to have an abortion, but that is only one issue. And what we are seeing now is really terrifying, where you've got women, who need help who have an issue, a medical issue connected to reproduction, who cannot get the health care they need because doctors are afraid that they'll get prosecuted if they treat you. So that issue, a question of bodily autonomy, a question of freedom, is absolutely, I think, very much on the ballot. And we've seen, the Supreme Court has said it's up to the states, and there are definitely, big state differences. But then you're saying if you happen to be a woman who happens to live in a state where there is a majority that thinks that you should not be able to have access to any kind of medical decisions connected to your reproductive rights, that's very dangerous. So that is a very big issue. I will say, I think the decision to have an abortion is a very complicated one. I understand the moral issues. I don't think it's simple. But when it comes to who gets to make that decision, I am confident that it has to be the person who actually has her health and possibly her life on the line.
One more question here.
Hello, thank you so much, Ms. Slaughter, for this talk. It's been really enlightening. I guess it's the last question and it's fitting for what I was going to ask. I'm a big believer in, thinking about digesting what you've said after a talk such as this. And I just wanted to know what were your final thoughts and final think pieces that we should bring in and we should talk within our own circles and, that kind of closing thoughts.
So I will say I write roughly once every other month for the Financial Times, and I write for Project Syndicate once every other month. So there's plenty of Anne-Marie Slaughter to read out there. What I would take away, and I invite you to the New America website, is where we started with these enormous changes. They're happening here too. If I go to Brussels, where my grandparents lived and I went, or to any major European city, it looks really different than it did 40 years ago. The world is changing. The countries that used to be much more homogeneous are changing. In the United States, that is a historic change. It is a change that, for me, I really do think about what will the next 250 years of our country look like. I see an incredibly bright future. I can see a future in which we really do reflect the whole world, that we can prove that all human beings are created equal and have equal chances, or at least we can get a lot closer to that. We have made incredible strides over my lifetime. When Barack Obama was running for president, I just thought, I cannot believe this. This was so inconceivable to somebody growing up in Virginia in the 1960s and 70s. It was unimaginable. And the strides women have made, and looking first at Hillary Clinton and now at Kamala Harris, I can see a very bright future. I can also see a country that, at some point fights another civil war. Not next year, not maybe in 10 years, but going the way we're going. That's what's happening. So ultimately, I think we have to think about these big changes, and we have to try to see one another as human beings who differ and not the enemy. I believe that in the United States, and I believe that in the world. I may really dislike the governments of many countries, but I do not believe the people are evil in any way. And then think about what can we do, both within our countries and in the world, to sort of elevate that common humanity. Nature is doing that. It doesn't matter who we are, what country we are, what anything we are when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the next pandemic, when it comes to, are we going to have access to food and water? And I think we can't sort of pretend that there aren't states out there. We can't pretend that there aren't politics out there. But we can really try to elevate our collective humanity in both. So that's what I'd leave you with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Right.
And thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.